Justice Tech Pros here. Happy New Year to everybody. With the New Year's Day off, I actually was catching up on some of my shows that I enjoy watching. I had some time to enjoy with the family and time to relax. And I gave that show a rewatch that I mentioned a while back. It's called Exhibit A on Netflix. And I enjoy watching these things because I also believe it helps prepare me for my occupation, and prepares me in the sense that it opens up my mind up to make sure that certain things aren't missed. You know, I try to read related items, related subject matter, and watch documentaries, all that are kind of intertwined and kind of related to the legal field and realm, because I believe a lot of the time it'll help you prepare. You know, unfortunately, when you're watching other people who have suffered, you are able to prepare and to try to prevent certain things that took place on their case from taking place on your case or on, clients' cases. And, on the episode I was watching was Exhibit A. It's broken down into 4 parts. And the first part I was watching was video forensics. And it was very interesting. It's an interesting segment, and they go, it talks about, they go on to spotlight a specific case. It was a guy, George Powell, in Texas, and I'll get into that in a bit. But when it started off, they're showing a forensic analysis expert on video forensics, and the gentleman is talking about how, you can't always believe what's on a video tape. And he's quoted, he actually says he's always nervous when someone says this case is all about the video. And he goes on to explain how video by definition is actually a trick, because a video is, all mini snapshots, all mini pictures that are then played out to form the video. So he was explaining how it can be deceitful, and it's not always as it appears. He gave an example how if you get a video of a weapon being discharged, and you'll see certain sparks come out of the muzzle. Say you see 3 sparks, one would assume that 3 shots were fired. And he was explaining that that's not accurate, because it all has to do with the speed of the camera filming the muzzle blasts. And if the camera, is at a slower speed, it's not going to pick up every individual shot. It'd have to be at a high-speed camera to pick up each time the weapon's discharged. So he just kind of used that as an example that even though something's on video, it also has to be interrogated. And I actually like the way he used that word for video. He almost made it like a witness, where he says interrogated, basically to put it under scrutiny. And I'm going to play an excerpt speaking about that.
We're going to assume the video is inaccurate. We want to know how much we can rely on this video. So I'm going to interrogate this witness.
And I really like the way he puts that. He's going to interrogate the witness. He's going to interrogate the video. He's going to put the video under scrutiny. And that's what's needed. I mean, that's what's important. It should be put to a test. And I think jurors need that explained to them. When a case is being presented, and experts come on and they talk about video and they play video, you could see the jurors enamored by it. And that's just human nature. They see something on video and they swear by it. It's so important to bring the other side of that. And you have to bring individuals such as this gentleman that show the other side. This way it kind of opens their mind up to understand, so they could grasp all is not what they are seeing. Everything is not as it appears. What you're seeing is not always accurate. And you need somebody with intelligence and with the expertise to explain why that is. Not to just throw it out there, because people will brush it off. You need a logical, scientific explanation for it. And, watching this episode, it really, really drives that point home, how important that is. And he goes on to, this is again the forensic video expert, and I don't remember his name, but he goes on to also explain what I was just touching on, how the jury, they automatically assume that the video is accurate. So I want to play a little excerpt about that.
Most people think that the video speaks for itself. An image is worth 1,000 words. But these images are not what they appear to be in most cases. So now, as I move through the images, the camera is just another witness. It needs to be interrogated, needs to be examined and questioned. Questioned with suspicion. What happens is...
See, and that's a great point. He's saying it's got to be questioned with suspicion. And too many times defense lawyers and whatnot, they let that aspect go. They don't bring that to the forefront. And what I mean by that is if you have video evidence against your client, if that's one of the discovery items that's going to be presented at trial, where there's some type of video footage or anything that has a video capture, you need to be ready, and you need to have an oppositional witness expert that's not only going to poke holes in it, but that's going to educate the jurors. Kind of do like I'm doing now, open their eyes up to see that although something's on video, it's not always reliable, and it has to be interrogated and it has to be pulled apart. And too many times that's just not done. I like this excerpt as well. He explains how when you go to a crime scene, you have different witnesses. Everybody has their own point of view and their own interpretation of what took place. And, the investigators talk to everybody and they get that interpretation. And he explains how video is no different. There's its interpretation on the video as well, and it has to be dissected and it has to be interrogated. So I'm just going to play that.
When we look at a crime scene, we have witnesses. We ask all the witnesses, what did you see? What did you perceive? Everybody should have a different perception. The video is no different. The camera might have a wide-angle lens. The camera might be more sensitive to low light. We never look at the camera as a foolproof witness because in most cases it's not going to be. The expectation of the public is if it's on camera, it's real. And it's reliable. It's not.
See, and that's so important. I mean, what he says is the expectation of the public is if it's on camera, it's real and it's reliable. And he says it's not. And once a trial starts, it's very rare that you hear that side of it and you hear somebody from that perspective breaking down a video and breaking down how what they're seeing may not be accurate and going into detail of why it's not accurate and really explaining the rationale behind it, the scientific reasoning behind it, just to enlighten the jurors and let the jurors realize what they're looking at. There's more to it. And the reasons why there's more to it is because of, A, B, and C. And then they lay it all out for the jurors. And you don't realize the impact that could have, because once trial starts and the jurors start seeing these things and they hear it and they have that, and if they feel what they're looking at is 100% accurate and what the prosecutor is telling them is on the tape is what is represented, what's playing out, and there's nothing to rebut that. That's a serious problem. That's a serious defect in the defense. And you have to fill that gap, and you got to make sure you have that ready to go when trial starts. And just to give you the backstory on this episode and what it was based on, the whole video forensics aspect of it could be applied to any case that uses that type of technology. And I've encountered it in our last trial, and I touched on this on one of the prior episodes where they were making a big deal, or I should say they were focusing on, not making a big deal because it is an important piece of the discovery, but they were focusing on and making it matter of fact that the car on the video was definitely, without a doubt, the automobile owned by one of the defendants. And they failed to mention, whereas all you could guarantee that was on that video was that was a generation of the car. In other words, they had I believe it was a 4th generation Hyundai, which was a car that was made between 2008, 9, 10, 11, and 12, or actually 9, 10, 11, 12. And the defendant owned a 2012 Hyundai. So all they could have really said was it was a 4th generation Hyundai. But the prosecution, obviously they're not going to put it that way. They're going to say this is the defendant's car. And what would have been so important was the defense to to go on to talk about how, no, all you could really say is that this is a fourth generation Hyundai. You cannot say beyond a reasonable doubt that this is the defendant's car, and even bring in an expert to support that. And it just goes to show how important those experts come to be, because when it's not done, the jury's left with that image that the prosecutor put in their head. The image of this is the car, or the image of whatever they're seeing on the video is how the prosecutor wants it to play out. And just getting back to this Exhibit A, the story behind this, there was a gentleman by the name of George Powell, and he was like a up-and-coming rapper in Texas, and he was trying to sell CDs. He would sell his CDs and things like that. He'd hang out at gas stations selling his CDs, and it goes into how I talk about how when you become a target. And this is, it's a small town in Texas, and this guy, he wasn't a friend of the cops. He was what they would call him a thug. That's what they labeled him. He would always mess with the cops, and he got arrested a lot for solicitation for selling his CDs, and he was on their radar. So what happened was somebody robbed a gas station, a couple gas stations, and right away you could see the cops were trying to make it as if this George Powell was the one responsible. Now the problem is when the robber walked into the convenience store, when you walk into a store, sometimes they'll have the height markings on the door to signify just when somebody's walking in, to almost scale it of how tall somebody is. So when this person walked in, one of the initial officers, the detectives looking at the video footage, noticed that he was 5'6", and also the cashier said she was pretty much eye level with the robber, and that was about 5'6", 5'7". Now this wasn't good enough because the guy George is 6'3", so this wasn't good enough for a lot of for the cops who wanted to target him. So they had to figure out how to make this work. And what's scary is what they did immediately was they opened up the hotlines, the tip lines, and they told anybody who calls in will get, I think, $1,000 tip for saying who it is. So some lady called and said she recognized it as the individual as the guy George. They put a picture of the guy on the news. Now, of course, they didn't talk about the height difference. They just put a picture on the news, and somebody called and said they think it was the guy named George. Now, one of the cashiers knew it wasn't George because of the height, and she was familiar with the guy George because he would sell the CDs, so she knew it couldn't have been him. So the detectives went to, I believe the robber robbed about 4 or 5 different gas stations. So they went around to the different gas stations till they could find one of the cashiers who kind of gave in. The original cashier who wouldn't give in, she was talking about how she was fighting with the detectives, telling them, no, it can't be George because I was able to see this guy in his eyes, and when George would come in, I would have to look up at him. So they kind of moved away from her, and they focused on this other cashier, and it was crazy. I mean, they went in, they had about 15 different mugshots of people, and what this detective did was he covered every other one except for the guy George and one other one, and told the cashier, well, it could be George, right? He just... Out of 15 mugshots, he left 2 open, and one of them was George, and she pointed to that one. And that's how they got an identification. I mean, it's crazy what takes place here. And, and that was after the other cashiers wouldn't go along with it. One of the cashiers, wouldn't go along with saying it was the guy George. So, again, it just goes into how they manipulate things. If they target somebody, and they're going to do what they got to do to get that person on the hook. And it's insanity when you hear these things play out. And this guy's in jail for 10 years now. It's going on 10 years. And then what they did was the government brought in an expert. So they brought in and this guy's a quote-unquote expert because as the show went on, you found out this guy's credentials, and he really wasn't an expert. So they brought in this guy, and this guy gave this whole model, and he said how the person on the video actually could have been 6'1", so he chalked that up, and that's how they were able to kind of come up with the 9-inch difference. The guy George is 6'3". The guy in the video was showing 5'6", 5'7", but this supposed expert recreated a model, and he said, that he was really 6'1". And what's crazy is he really didn't give a legitimate explanation for it. It's just the jurors believed he was an expert, so the BS he was selling them, they just believed it because there was nobody to refute it, nobody to go against it. That's why you need that oppositional expert, because, you know, he got on there, he said his nonsense, and they bought it. And if you don't have anybody who could refute that, you got a big problem. And it's all about, you know, like I always talk about the smoke and mirrors. That's what they did. They knew they had to get an expert, and they used their smoke and mirrors. So when this show is going on, how, you know, it was done incorrectly and what took place, and they wound up finding out that this expert never prior did he ever do a height identification. He was actually an accident recreationist expert. He never did height identification. This was the first time he did it, but yet he was qualified to say that the guy in the video was 6'1". I mean, it was crazy. You know, that this was the guy that they brought in, and he used this software called Photo Modular, and it was really just to impress the jury. It wasn't even the software that's supposed to be used for that kind of investigative work. It's just a 3D model rendering software. You know, it's like if you're creating like a 3D character or so. It's just a rendering software. It's not even used in that kind of way or fashion, and he just used it to almost mesmerize the jury, you know, to show, oh, look at this 3D model. It's just more of an impressive look to fool them. And that's what's scary. And because of this, Texas was the first state in 2013, they passed a junk science law, which basically any convicted individual based on bad science, they were able to get another shot because of things like this. Because once this was questioned and they showed that this guy had no basis for his supposed expert testimony and somebody was in jail over it, you know, they enacted that. And that's huge to have that, you know, because when they start throwing around this fake science and this BS science and passing off like fact when it's nothing but a bunch of smoke and mirrors, it's dangerous. And so the show goes on to then discuss how they wound up, the state, once the guy George's attorney who got involved to help his case, they wrote the state board of forensic. It's like the board of state forensics out in Texas for experts, and they questioned about that testimony that was given. And what happened was the commission then assigned a new scientist, a new forensic expert, to review the video footage. This wasn't from the defense team. This was actually from the state organization for the board, the state board commission. And they assigned a new forensic video expert. And what he did was he went to the jail and he actually got a 3D scanner. And the scanner actually measured George. You know, it went throughout his whole body, took thousands of images, pictures of George from head to foot, a 3D scan of his whole entire body, and then what they were able to do is recreate his actual physique and his actual body within the storefront. So they took an image of the storefront from the surveillance cameras of the perpetrator walking into the store, and they lined it up with the 3D analysis of George, and you were able to see instantly it was like a 9-inch difference. It didn't even compare. So when the science is done properly, then that's where you see results. But when it's done improperly and it's not challenged, it has devastating results. I mean, this guy's sitting in jail. You know, I didn't research it to see if he got out. I'm going to check that out. But he's sitting in jail as of this show, and this show just came out. And you know what? I actually just looked it up real quick on my phone, and he was released now. He was granted a retrial, and he's released pending his retrial based on everything going on. So, you know, these documentaries do a lot of good. I mean, a lot of stuff gets, unfortunately, there's not enough of them because there's so many innocent people who are away and there's not enough spotlighting them. But the ones that do come out, they do a lot of good. One last excerpt I want to play is just from one of the individuals who got involved in the case after the fact. He's talking about kind of what I hit on earlier, where if somebody's given testimony and they're being passed along as an expert, it's hard to refute that if you're not an expert. So, you know, for the judge and for the jury, they just believe whatever the guy says. And I just want to play a little piece along those lines.
It's hard to call bullshit on a forensic science when your background is not in that forensic science. The judge doesn't know. If it sounds good to him or her, they're going to let it in. And I think jurors, when in doubt, well, the judge let it in. It must be good science. It must be good testimony.
And that statement's so powerful, and that's what the jurors think. The jurors think, well, if the judge let it in, it must be good. And that really runs the gamut on so many things. I mean, if you've been listening to all my prior episodes and they all kind of go into one another, and even now I'm enjoying the segments I'm doing on shows, I like breaking them down and just explaining them for the audience. And like I said, they help me both in my professional life and personal life. I enjoy understanding how things work and how things are solved and how wrongs are righted and things like that. And that statement's so powerful. When a judge lets something in, the judge doesn't realize what kind of message that sends to the jurors. By allowing things to be presented, a lot of the jurors believe, well, if the judge let it in, then it's good to go. And I think that's a lot of the, then that falls into a lot of the assumptions, unfortunately, that defense counsel makes, where I think maybe sometimes they feel they don't have to fight something because it's so, in their mind, blatantly obvious, we'll move on. But that's just not the case. I mean, one thing I'm learning is you have to fight every single thing that pops up. And, you get experts, you fight every expert. You get the list from the government of who they're having as an expert witness, you have to get a rebuttal expert witness. It just has to go that way. And you as the defendant, and even, if you're part of the defense team, you got to fight for that. You got to make sure that's what the lead defense attorney does. They got to follow through on that. And, it's scary when you're part of a multi-defendant case. You may have instances where your co-defendants need an expert, but you really don't. It doesn't affect, say, your client, but your co-defendants need a rebuttal expert. And if they don't get that rebuttal expert, it could affect you, even though it may have nothing to do with you. Sometimes it's just, when there's enough things, enough mud thrown at the wall, sometimes something sticks. And unfortunately, different defendants could get hit with almost shrapnel. So it's so important for the teams, when you're part of a team, to all work together and everybody be on the same page. And everybody fight to the best of their ability, And if one of the defendants requires an expert, you got to push and make sure that expert is utilized. And if everybody agrees that they're going to get an expert, you got to hold them to it. Make sure that expert shows up and does their job, because it could have devastating impact. And, that's the reality of it sometimes. And it's scary when you see how these things play out and you see, the jury really has no idea, and you see the tactics that the government will use, and they'll bring in these quote-unquote experts. But yet, if you have somebody of equal or greater caliber on the other side of it, they could destroy them. They can make something that seemed so powerful mute. They can make it mean absolutely nothing, meaningless, if you have the right guy. And this Netflix documentary, there's other segments I'm gonna rewatch. I saw them a while back, but I'm gonna rewatch and do something similar on the next few episodes where I could just break them down. But the one's on Godiva dogs, one's on Touch DNA, which I want to talk about that one, because I found it interesting how even myself, when you hear DNA, you just assume how conclusive it is, but that's not the case either. And I want to be able to cite some legitimate sources for that before I begin to talk about it. But it's a really good show, so try to watch it. I think, honestly, things like that should be almost required watching for all potential jurors, because you need to be aware of all of these things. And the state and the government, they take advantage of the lack of knowledge that people have, and they'll manipulate it, and they'll use it. They'll really make it bigger and make it seem more important than it really is, and they'll do a shell game, almost like where you're moving stuff around and you're not really revealing where the ball is under the shells. You're just moving it around. The ball's there, you just don't know where it is. And they kind of do that show game. They move the facts around like that. And you almost confuse the jury so much so that, they just feel, well, this is above my head, it's above my pay grade, so if this expert's saying it, I must not understand it, so it must be true. And it's such a devastating logic and ideology, because it's so dangerous to believe that way and to feel, and, to succumb to that. If your life is in somebody's hands, a juror's hands, and they're buying into everything that the state's saying, the government's saying, the prosecution's saying, and you don't have the right defense team fighting for you and putting up a defense to refute these things. It's terrible. I mean, the end result is life-ending, life-changing at the very least. Bouncing around a little bit, I have an article that a friend of mine sent me. It was December 29th, how this was in the Daily News, New York Daily News, and it's this Grafton Thomas, a Muncie stabbing suspect, was covered in blood when caught, is the headlines. Basically, this guy stabbed Jewish worshipers with a machete, and they gave him bail, $5 million bail. And, it's just amazing. They sent this to me, obviously, because my friend has the same philosophy that I do, that it's amazing how some people get bail and some don't. And this is a prime example of it. I mean, you have this guy, I don't know what's more of a danger to society. This guy is bothering poor Jewish people who are worshiping and celebrating Hanukkah. This lowlife's going in and stabbing them and attacking them with a machete. If that isn't a danger to society, I don't know what is, but yet they won't grant bail to somebody of Italian-American descent who has a stigma attached to him and is being charged with RICO. That person gets denied bail. And there's no charges of attacking somebody or going after innocent people, but yet they don't get bail, and this guy gets bail. So one day I need somebody to explain that to me, because I just don't understand it. I don't understand these things. I don't understand what dictates that. The only thing that dictates that is personal vendettas. It's not going by what's fair and what's logical. That's just personal vendettas. If you feel somebody is guilty of something, or you feel they hold an alleged position in some kind of enterprise, and you just don't want to let them out because you want to put pressure on them, you don't give them bail. A guy like this, you can't really put pressure on, so you give him bail. You see things like that every day, and it doesn't make any sense to me. And one of the items that I found interesting too, and I'm jumping back and forth, but that's just my style. I'm sure you're getting used to that by now. But what was amazing was these cops in that Exhibit A, they called the guy George's wife down to the precinct. And these are broke, they're poor individuals. They don't have wealth. They need money. And they told his own wife, listen, if you give us a tip and just say it was your husband, you get $1,000 for the tip. It's like a tip chat line, whatever it is, a tip hotline. And they told her, if you tell us it's your husband, we'll give you $1,000. Now, she was like, it's not my husband, so I'm not going to lie and tell you that. And this poor woman could have used the money. She's raising 2 kids by herself, and that's what they dangle over their head. And again, it all just goes back to look at the tactics they use. And now let's say this guy George, God willing, everything turns out all right. He proves his innocence. Nothing's going to happen to any of these people. There's no accountability for the detectives involved, for the prosecutor who took this case on, for the supposed expert who just basically lied because he didn't have the capabilities to investigate the case properly. So in my opinion, he just lied about his facts and lied about his conclusions. And there's no repercussions. There's no accountability on any of those parties. None of them have to answer for anything. Nobody loses a license. Nobody gets discharged. Nobody gets fired. Nobody gets fined. Nobody gets put in jail. Nothing. It's just, okay, you made a mistake. And nobody sees anything wrong with that. Well, I shouldn't say nobody, because by going by my emails, going by my friends, going by my contacts, clients, there's a lot who do. But the problem is the general public is missing it. And I could tell based on a lot of the juries and a lot of decisions being rendered lately that they're just missing out on it. They're not understanding it. They're not going by the facts of the case. And if you get a chance, definitely check out that Exhibit A on Netflix. It's a great show to watch. I'm gonna watch the other three segments again. Like I said, one was you had the video forensics, then you had the Godiva. One was DNA, and I forgot the third one, but I'll see. In 6 days, I'm having Andrew Garrett on from Garrett Discovery. We're going to talk about the cell site technology and how that's considered junk science in many aspects. So that should be an interesting episode. I'm also trying to arrange to have a couple attorneys on. I think I mentioned to you guys earlier, so I'm just trying to, with the new year, it was a little hectic the last 3 weeks, so I'm going to try to focus on that. I think that'll be entertaining. I'm trying to come up with things that'll be entertaining while at the same time everybody could learn from and benefit from. There's also a lot of listeners that write in certain stories. Some they don't want to share on the podcast, so thank you for writing me. I appreciate it, and I am interested in reading it. But if you do want to share, just let me know, because I'll be glad to read it aloud, just to let the listeners also have some insight on what you're going through. And so with that, I think that's pretty much all I have for today. That episode was on my mind, so I wanted to talk to you guys about it. And if you have anything that you would want to hear discussed or brought up or touched on, feel free to drop an email, info@justicetechpros.com. Just put podcast in the subject, and that'll be forwarded to me, and I'll check it out. To that, I just want to say I appreciate the listeners. We're growing at a nice steady pace. It is increasing, so I think that we're doing some good here. I think that people are enjoying the content, and I'll continue to do my part and try to educate and expand and really dissect different things that come up that could influence and could help prepare the general public to be a more informed juror. And also, it's just good for everybody to be aware of what's taking place and what goes on. And that's it for today. Talk to you soon.